Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
Once upon a time, there was a simple story. It's not a long tale with lots of details. It's more like a quick story that someone told me. It's about a tower by the sea between Wales and Ireland. This tower looked old and rough on the outside, like it had seen many storms. But inside, it was a bit like a cozy summer house. It only had 2 floors. The first floor was the entrance, and there was a room above it. When I visited this tower, I was surprised. The inside was nothing like the outside. It was nice and comfy with fancy furniture. But what caught my eye the most was a painting on the wall. It showed a beautiful girl from a long time ago. She looked innocent and smart with a happy face. She was reading a big book and had a musical instrument and a bird with her. I was wandering around lost in the almost empty countryside when it started raining. I found this lonely tower and hoped it might give me some shelter. Just then, an old lady appeared and invited me inside. She explained that she had come from her nearby home to check on things and offered me a place to wait out the rain. As I stepped inside, I was surprised by how nice it was. I couldn't help but wonder about the painting of the girl and why it said she was invisible. The old lady shared bits of the story behind the painting, and my curiosity grew even more. A few years ago, on a September afternoon, a man arrived in a small town near the sea. The sky looked like it might storm later, but he needed to get to another town about 15 miles away. The local fishermen were afraid to go because of the weather, but 2 of them agreed to take him. One was a father with many children, tempted by the money the man offered. The other was the son of the lady who later hosted me, and he was eager for an adventure. As they sailed, the wind wasn't as strong as they hoped, and they had to row as well. They were still far from their destination when the wind got worse and the waves grew wild. They had to lower the sails and row hard. One man had to bail out water, and the man they called Vernon helped row. Before the storm they had talked, but now they were all quiet. One thought about his family, another just worked, and Vernon felt sorry for putting them in danger. He tried to encourage them and rowed as best as he could. The man bailing out water looked around often, as if searching for something in the sea. He suddenly said he saw a light that could save them. They all looked, but they only saw darkness. "You can't see it," said their friend, "but we're getting closer to it. God willing, we'll survive this night." Then he took the oar from Vernon, who was exhausted, and looked for the beacon that promised safety. It was hard to see at first, but as they moved closer, it became clearer. The light shone on the water, making it seem calmer. "What beacon is that?" asked Vernon, as they rowed more easily. "It's a strange one," said the older sailor. "It's in an old tower on a rock by the sea. We only noticed it this summer, and it appears every night. Some think it's made by witches or smugglers, but we don't know for sure. 2 groups have searched the tower, but found nothing. It's empty during the day and dark at night, except for the light when we're out at sea. I've heard it's made by the ghost of a girl whose sweetheart died nearby," added the younger sailor. "We call her the Invisible Girl." They reached the tower's landing, and the light was still burning. They struggled to land and pull their boat onto the beach. Climbing up to the tower, they found it dark and silent. "This won't do," said Vernon. "Our hostess should show us some light or sign of life." "We'll try to find the upper chamber," said the sailor, leading the way. "But we won't find the invisible girl or her light." "This is quite an unpleasant adventure," muttered Vernon, stumbling over the rough ground. "The keeper of the beacon must be old and grumpy." After many struggles, they reached the upper floor, but it was empty. They lay down to rest, tired from the journey. The sailors slept deeply, but Vernon woke after an hour. Unable to sleep, he sat by the window hole, thinking about his own troubles and feeling miserable. It would take a big book to explain why Henry Vernon, once a happy young man, became so sad. Henry was the only child of Sir Peter Vernon, who loved him but also had a bad temper. Henry grew up with a girl named Rosina, who was also like a daughter to Sir Peter. They were friends as children and later fell in love. Rosina worried that Sir Peter wouldn't approve of their love, but she hoped they were meant to be together. Henry wanted to wait until he was older to marry Rosina so they wouldn't upset Sir Peter. They kept their love a secret and spent time together happily. Rosina played music and sang to Sir Peter, which calmed him down. Life was like a paradise for Rosina and Henry, but then Sir Peter's sister came to visit. She was mean and soon figured out about Henry and Rosina's love. She told Sir Peter, who got angry. He sent Henry away and forced Rosina to marry someone else. Rosina faced violence and insults from Sir Peter and his sister. Despite their threats, she stayed strong and refused to obey. "There's more to this than meets the eye," said Sir Peter's sister. "I bet Rosina still talks to Henry in secret. Let's take her to our house in Wales, where she won't have anyone to help her. Then we'll see if she gives in to us." Sir Peter agreed, and they all went to live in a lonely house in Wales. Rosina's suffering became unbearable there. She used to be surrounded by friends and familiar places, but now she felt trapped. She was only allowed to talk to Mrs. Bainbridge's maid, who tricked her into confiding in her. Eventually, Rosina couldn't bear it anymore and wrote a letter to Henry, begging him to help her. But Sir Peter and his sister found the letter and were furious. They yelled at Rosina, calling her terrible names. They kicked her out of the house, saying she could never come back. Rosina left, crying and upset. No one knew where she went. Sir Peter pretended not to care, but he was secretly worried. He sent people to look for Rosina, but they couldn't find her. He started to regret how he had treated her. He even hoped she was still alive, even though he had been so cruel to her. When Henry heard about Rosina's disappearance, he came back from his travels. He wanted to know what happened to her. He asked everyone, but no one knew. Finally, he learned the truth from the servants and his aunt. He was heartbroken and filled with despair. Henry's only wish was to find out what happened to Rosina and to bring her back, even if it was just her body. That's why he ended up in the deserted tower, thinking about Rosina's suffering and what had driven her to such despair. As Vernon sat lost in sad thoughts, listening to the sea's constant roar, he noticed the morning light slowly appearing in the east. His companions woke up, hungry after a long night without food. Their boat was damaged, so they decided to go to a nearby fisherman's cottage for breakfast and to fix the boat later. As they left the tower, Vernon looked around but saw no sign of anyone living there. He started to think the light he had seen was just his imagination. They reached the cottage, where they ate and rested before returning to the tower to fix the boat. Vernon and the fisherman talked about the invisible girl and her light, but no one knew what caused it. The fisherman mentioned seeing a girl in the woods nearby and suspected she might be the invisible girl, but they weren't sure. The sailors spent the whole day repairing the boat while Vernon explored the tower and the surrounding pine forest. He found nothing of interest until he stumbled upon a small slipper on the ground. It was so tiny, like Cinderella's slipper. Vernon couldn't help but think of Rosina, whose feet were small like the slipper. He wondered if it belonged to the invisible girl. Thinking of Rosina made him feel even sadder, and he cried for her tragic fate. In the evening, the men stopped working, and Vernon went back to the cottage with them to sleep. They planned to continue their journey the next morning if the weather was good. Vernon kept the slipper to himself and returned to the cottage with the sailors. He often looked back at the tower, but there was no light anymore. They all settled in the cottage for the night, and Vernon was offered the only bed, but he chose to sleep on a pile of leaves instead. He slept for a few hours and woke up to silence, except for the sound of the others sleeping. He looked out the window and saw the light still burning in the tower. Vernon decided to go back to the tower and return the slipper to its owner. He walked swiftly to the tower, hoping to surprise the invisible girl before she could hide. But as he climbed up, he accidentally made a noise, and she seemed to disappear. Vernon entered the tower, but it was dark and quiet. He could feel someone else was there too. He spoke softly, offering his help. Suddenly, he heard his name, and Rosina's voice spoke to him from the darkness. He rushed towards her voice and found her in his arms. He couldn't see her, but he felt her presence, and it filled him with joy. They embraced, and even though she was invisible, he knew she was there with him, alive and safe. The next morning they sailed towards El, with a fair wind. As the morning light shone, Rosina's invisible form became visible again. She looked different because of all the suffering she had endured, but her smile and her gentle blue eyes remained the same. Vernon showed her the slipper, explaining why he had been determined to find her. However, Rosina was still filled with fear because of Sir Peter's threats and Mrs. Bainbridge's cruelty. She had fled without a plan, driven only by terror. She had ended up at the deserted tower, where she had been hiding, sleeping in the vault and burning pine cones for light at night. She was afraid of being discovered by Sir Peter and had been longing for Henry's return, fearing she might never see him again. After her rescue, Rosina fell ill, but with Henry's care, she gradually recovered. It took many months for her to regain her strength and the joy she had lost. Sir Peter, relieved of his remorse, now fully supported Rosina's marriage to Henry. They spent time in their Welsh mansion, where Rosina had found refuge and happiness after her ordeal. Henry even decorated the tower where they had reunited, cherishing the memories of their love and the trials they had overcome together.